The sound of roaring engines echoed through the quiet street as a group of bikers cruised past a small, local CAF. It was a scene that had become all too familiar to the elderly man sitting outside, sipping his coffee, enjoying a rare moment of peace. But today would be different. As the bikers stopped at the corner, one of them spotted the man and, with a smirk, made a rude comment. The others joined in, laughing and insulting the man, unaware of who they were really mocking. What they didn't know was that this elderly man wasn't just another quiet, helpless figure. He was a decorated Vietnam veteran, a man who had sacrificed more than they could ever understand. As the insults flew, he sat there, composed, his past as a soldier holding him steady. But something was about to shift. The bikers, thinking they had the upper hand, didn't expect the reaction that was coming. They just unknowingly disrespected a man who had seen horrors far beyond their comprehension. But what would happen next? Would they learn the truth before it was too late? Stay tuned to find out. As the insults grew louder, the elderly man remained motionless, his hands wrapped around his cup of coffee. To an outsider, he might have appeared to be just another frail old man, caught up in the noise of the world around him. But in his mind, the world was a much different place, one filled with memories that had shaped him into someone far stronger than what his age or appearance suggested. The bikers, oblivious to the man's true identity, continued with their jabs, one after another. Their laughter rang out in the crisp morning air, each word sharper than the last. "Hey, Gramps. You lost your dentures? Or is it your mind that's gone?" One of the bikers jeered, elbowing his friend beside him. "Maybe you should go back to your nursing home, Grandpa." Their mocking voices were the kind that carried with the arrogance of youth untouched by time or hardship. It wasn't just the words themselves that stung, it was the utter disrespect, the assumption that the man sitting there had no history, no worth. They saw him as an easy target, a harmless old man with no way of fighting back. But they couldn't have been more wrong. The man's name was unknown to them, as was the depth of his past. He'd never been one to boast, to flaunt his service or accomplishments. To him, his medals and ribbons were reminders of battles he wished he could forget. He had lived with the scars, mental and physical, of a war that had taken more from him than he ever thought possible. His comrades had come home in coffins, some too broken to recognize. He had survived, but the cost had been high. He carried that weight every day. Years had passed since the war, but the pain had never fully left him. And now, here they were, these bikers, thinking that mocking him would be easy, just another game. They had no idea that the man they were belittling was someone who had faced the worst humanity could offer and walked away with only a fraction of his soul intact. One of the bikers, a man with a large, tattooed arm, swaggered forward, his voice filled with bravado. "What's the matter, old man? Too slow to hear us? You're not deaf, are you?" He leaned in, grinning like he'd won some sort of victory. The elderly man finally moved. His hand, trembling slightly, reached for his hat. He took a long breath, savoring the moment, grounding himself in the present. The bikers watched, a few of them nudging each other, expecting him to break down, to shout back, to show some kind of weakness. Instead, he looked up, his eyes cold and steady. "Do you know who I am?" he asked, his voice low, but unmistakably firm. For a moment, there was silence. The bikers exchanged confused glances. This wasn't the reaction they had expected. One of them, the one who had spoken first, leaned back on his bike and snorted dismissively. "Who cares who you are, old man? Just go back to your rocking chair." The elderly man didn't flinch. "I served," he said, his voice cutting through the laughter. "In Vietnam. I was there when the bombs dropped. When the ground shook, and men died around me. I was there when we lost more than we gained. But I survived. And I'm still here." The words hung in the air, but the bikers didn't immediately respond. The atmosphere shifted from playful mockery to something more uncertain, as though a heavy weight had been dropped into the conversation. Some of the younger bikers shifted uncomfortably, their faces no longer filled with arrogance but confusion. They had expected a fight, but they hadn't prepared for this. One of them, a taller man with a scruffy beard, spoke up.
"Wait, you're telling us you fought in Vietnam?"
He asked, his tone a little more cautious now, but still skeptical.
"What are you, like, a war hero or something?" The elderly man's gaze did not waver. "I didn't come back a hero. I came back alive. That's enough for me."
But the moment of silence was quickly broken when the tattooed biker chuckled darkly.
"So what? You expect us to just bow down to you now? You're just an old man. Nobody cares about your war. It's over."
The anger that had been simmering inside the elderly man, the frustration he had held for so many years, began to surface. He had been told that no one cared before. That the sacrifices of those who had served in wars like Vietnam had been forgotten, swept under the rug by those who didn't know, or worse, didn't care. He had spent decades hearing that same dismissal from people who were too young to understand, too ignorant to realize the weight of what had been lost.
But this time, it was different.
This time, they had gone too far. His voice, now hard and clear, cut through the tension.
"You think it's over? You think just because the war's behind us, it doesn't matter? You think because I'm old, I don't remember the faces of my brothers who died out there? You think that's something you can forget just because it's not on the news anymore?"
For a long moment, the bikers stood still, as if his words had cast a spell over them. They had no idea how to respond. It was as if they were suddenly seeing him for the first time not as an old man, but as someone with history, someone who had lived through things they couldn't even begin to imagine. The tattooed biker, however, was the first to break the silence, his bravado returning.
"Whatever, old man. We don't need to hear your sob story. This is just some weird attention grab."
But something had shifted. The rest of the bikers looked at each other uncertainly. The taller one with the scruffy beard took a step back. "Maybe we should just go," he said, his voice unsure. The tension between them was palpable. They had crossed a line, and for the first time, they weren't sure where it led.
The elderly man didn't respond.
He simply took another sip of his coffee, his hand still steady around the cup, as if he were already dismissing them from his mind. But inside, the conflict raged on. His past was a burden he carried every day, a silent weight he had learned to endure. And yet, every time someone belittled him or dismissed the sacrifices made by so many, it was as if that weight grew heavier. And now, it wasn't just about him. It was about the countless others who had fought, bled, and died in a war that history had chosen to forget.
Would these bikers ever understand? Would they walk away from this encounter with a shred of respect, or would they continue on, oblivious to the price paid for their freedom?
The air was thick with unspoken words.
The bikers weren't laughing anymore, but the tension hadn't fully dissipated.
The man, steady as ever, had made his point, but the consequences of that confrontation were still in the air, unresolved.
Would the bikers leave and go on with their lives, unchanged? Or would they finally come to understand the true meaning of respect?
As the silence stretched on, the elderly man knew one thing for certain: whatever happened next, the bikers would never look at him the same way again. And perhaps, just perhaps, they might carry a piece of his story with them whether they wanted to or not. The tension in the air was palpable, but something in the elderly man's calmness seemed to make the bikers pause. As they stood there, fidgeting on their bikes, a few of them began to glance around at one another, unsure of what to do next. The tattooed man, still grinning but no longer with the same bravado, scoffed and made a half-hearted attempt to shrug off the situation. "Come on, let's go," he said, but his voice lacked the usual authority. He looked back at the old man one last time, but the words that followed were far from mocking.
"You know, maybe you're right. Maybe we should just leave it alone."
His tone was softer now, less taunting. A few of the other bikers nodded in agreement, shuffling their feet uncomfortably. The air had shifted, and the easygoing arrogance that had been so evident moments before had now turned into something else, a mix of confusion, embarrassment, and perhaps a little shame. It was then that the elderly man slowly stood up, his old joints creaking with the effort. The bikers, still unsure of what was happening, watched him closely. He turned his back to them and began to walk toward the CAF door, his pace deliberate but steady. Before stepping inside, he paused and glanced over his shoulder. "It's not about me," he said, his voice quiet but clear. "It's about all the ones who didn't make it back. You should remember that." With that, he disappeared into the CAF, leaving the bikers in a stunned silence. They stood there for what felt like an eternity, each of them lost in their thoughts. The sound of their bikes, once a source of power and dominance, now felt muted against the weight of the conversation that had just unfolded. They were no longer just a group of guys making fun of an old man, they were individuals, each now aware of the depth of what had been said. After a few minutes, the tattooed biker finally spoke again, breaking the silence. "Man, what just happened?" he muttered, his voice quiet, almost introspective. "That guy, he wasn't just some old guy, was he?" The scruffy bearded biker shook his head slowly. "No, man. He wasn't." Another biker, the youngest of the group, took a deep breath and pushed his helmet off. "I don't know about you guys, but I feel like we just crossed a line. Like, we've gotta do something. We can't just let it end like this." The group looked around at one another, the weight of the moment pressing on them all. The insults, the laughter, it had all seemed harmless in the beginning, just part of their usual routine. But now, in the aftermath, it felt hollow. It felt wrong. "Yeah," the taller biker with the scruffy beard agreed, running a hand through his hair. "Maybe we need to make this right. I don't know how, but we can't just walk away like this." They all stood there, unsure of what to do next. The incident with the elderly man had triggered something inside each of them, something they hadn't expected. They were used to being tough, to being the loudest voices in the room. But now, in the quiet aftermath, the reality of what they had done seemed far more important than any ego they had. After a few minutes, the tattooed biker let out a long sigh. "All right, let's head back to that CAF. Maybe we can talk to the guy, apologize or something. I don't know. But we owe him that much." And so, with a newfound sense of humility, the bikers rode back to the CAF. The man had already gone inside, and the staff had no idea where he had gone. But the bikers didn't need a grand gesture or some immediate payoff, they just needed to reflect on the words that had been spoken and the realization that came with it. The ride back was quieter than usual, and the roar of their bikes no longer seemed to fill the air with as much power. As they pulled up outside, they parked their bikes and walked into the CAF, the bell over the door chiming softly as they entered. The staff greeted them with a mix of surprise and confusion, but the bikers barely noticed. Their eyes scanned the room, but the elderly man was nowhere to be found. Disappointed but not defeated, they sat down at a table, unsure of what to do next. They ordered drinks and sat in silence for a while, reflecting on what had just happened. The youngest of the group, the one who had spoken the most earlier, was the first to break the silence. "Do you think he was just, messing with us?" he asked quietly. "No," the scruffy bearded biker replied after a moment, his voice thoughtful. "I think he was serious. He wasn't trying to get revenge or make us feel guilty. He was just telling us the truth." There was a long pause as the group considered his words. The tattooed biker spoke up again. "I think we need to think about what he said. About the ones who didn't make it back." The youngest biker shifted in his seat, staring into his drink. "I never thought about it like that. I mean, we joke about stuff all the time, but there's a whole side to things we just don't see. I guess we took it all for granted." After a while, the bikers stood up to leave, each of them carrying the weight of the conversation they had just had. It wasn't resolved, not yet. There was still more to process, more to think about. But it was a step, an important one. As they got back on their bikes and rode off into the afternoon, they didn't speak much. There was an unspoken understanding between them now, a realization that they had been changed by encounter with the elderly man. The man himself, wherever he was now, would never know just how much his simple words had impacted them. But in that small CAF, at that moment in time, he had reminded them of something they had all forgotten. Respect, history, sacrifice, these weren't just things from the past. They were lessons that could shape the future. And as the bikers rode through the quiet streets, each of them reflected on day's events, understanding that sometimes the most powerful lessons come from the least expected sources. The elderly man, whose name they never learned, had given them a gift. A gift that would stay with them long after they left the CAF and rode back into their own worlds. The next time they would joke about someone, they would remember the man they had underestimated. They would remember that sometimes, the people we least expect have most powerful stories to tell. And they would carry that memory with them, hoping it would change how they treated others from then on. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one where respect and understanding mattered more than ever. The bikers had learned their lesson. And somewhere, deep down, they knew it was one they would carry with them for the rest of their lives.